then we had planned to do the FDR, the Four Freedoms, in April of 2020, and that all went south.
Oh, yeah.
So when I saw that wheelchair, I thought, is that the wheelchair you were going to have for me? But I think that one's much nicer. I think the museum one was pretty decrepit, if I remember correctly.
It was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a new one that I just adopted from a regular one. I just turned it around. So I did, so the wheels were small wheels were in back. A friend of mine did all the engineering for me, and it's just painted black, and it's got a standard kitchen chair, office chair in the back. So I was back at Hyde Park. Well, I'll tell you, I'll get into that later because
yeah,
we're talking about FDR. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, Jeff, I hear it's 94 degrees in Burnett today.
94, that'd be great. That'd be like a cold front.
Actually, I looked up Burnett on Wikipedia about an hour ago because I remember that's where you live, and 6,000 population. I can't imagine a town that small. I've never lived any place smaller than 25,000 people.
Well, that's more than doubled since I've lived here.
Yeah, I noticed that since 2010, it's just really sort of taken off.
Yeah.
But my wife.
So much like the town, what it encompasses with population, it includes things that aren't even really like city limits. There's city limits really haven't changed it. It's all these like developments. They're a 6,000 acre ranch will sell off, and the grandkids are like, "Great, let's sell it off as 10-acre tracts and make $1 gazillion." And Jeff Bezos bought land here not that long ago.
Digital 410 Productions proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Dodd Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast. And first and foremost, we want to thank each and every one of you who's been sticking around for the last 5 years. We couldn't do it without you because, well, without you, there'd be no reason to do it at all. But joining us, as always, live from Texas, Mr. Jeff Copsetta. Jeff, how you doing tonight, sir?
Good. I'm excited about tonight's show. I think we got a real whopper for our listeners tonight for sure.
Not only do we have a whopper, but we're kind of going back to the old school format, how the show originated, how it started. And tonight we are going to go back to basics and focus pretty much on living history. And as Jeff and I were talking before the show, the nice thing about having living historians on, particularly living historians who specialize in a particular impression and or persona, is they can bring the history on that particular topic and or persona. And so tonight we have Mr. Robert Tidwell joining us, and he is a man of multiple impressions and a man of multiple knowledge. And first and foremost, Mr. Tidwell, thank you for coming on the show. How are you doing tonight?
I can do my Elvis impression if you like, or I do a really great Clark Gable, but no, I'm fine, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I think Jeff would love to hear both of those impressions. He's obviously got the Clark Gable mustache, but he is a huge Elvis aficionado. Almost.
Well, my wife thinks he looks like Errol Flynn, so he's in very, very good company.
Well, there you go. So let's just go back a little bit and just start a baseline starting. How did you get into the history of World War II, the hobby of living history or reenacting as most people know it as? When did the bug bite you, and how long have you been spending your family's finances on silly collectibles and uniforms like the rest of us do?
Yeah, every time I hit that, that buy button on eBay, I feel guilty. But no, I have to blame my parents, which is, psychologically convenient. My parents were Pearl Harbor survivors. My dad was 30 years in the Navy. He joined in 35, retired in 1965. My parents were sent to Pearl Harbor in 1939 and were there for the attack. Wow. And we grew up with those stories. A great deal of pride. I have 2 older brothers and a younger sister. We were. What I found out later was sort of interesting is when I was 10, my dad retired, family retired to Coronado, Coronado is kind of like the San Antonio of San Diego, in the sense that San Antonio apparently has the largest collection of retired Army and Air Force generals in the world. Coronado has the largest collection of retired Navy admirals in the world. It's a great little town. It's adjacent to the Naval Air Station, North Island. what I found out many, many years later, although I knew a couple of my classmates in school had fathers who were at Pearl Harbor, I found out later there were 8 or 10 classmates who all had fathers who were at Pearl Harbor, and I had no idea. And had I known any of this, I certainly would have made an effort to try to track them down and talk to them if they would talk about it. So we grew up with those stories about World War II. My father, like a lot of veterans, didn't talk much about the details.
No, not at all.
And that was my mother who filled in the blanks. But she has some wonderful stories about living in Honolulu before the attack. And then I was always interested in theater. So I was, unconsciously try to find some way to combine the two. And my first real interest in this was when I was in high school. It was December 8th, 1971. And it was the 30th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I convinced the school administrators to play FDR's war address to Congress as if it was a bulletin coming in from President Nixon. And they went along with that, and they did that. And nobody understood why. But I always wanted to play FDR. I thought FDR was just such a great character because he's got a lot of charm and a lot of humor, which, with a lot of historical figures, you don't have that unless you're portraying Winston Churchill. So he was my main focus. And then as I got a little older, I learned more about MacArthur. Now, what's interesting about MacArthur, my dad being a Navy guy, wasn't terribly impressed with MacArthur, as most Navy guys are not. My mother thought he was absolutely wonderful. And she once told me that he's kind of like a Telemundo star. He's very, he's very emotional, and he's very, expressive with his emotions. And she thought this was absolutely great. So, I got 2 different stories about MacArthur, from whichever parent it was. But I think my first time I portrayed MacArthur was kind of interesting. It was a high school assembly, and someone had come up with the idea. It was for the homecoming, and the football team was coming back. And the commissioner of PEP, who was in charge of these things, said, we're going to have a theme. It's going to be called the No Substitute for Victory. That's going to be the theme of this this particular pep rally. I said, well, that's great. I'll come as MacArthur because he's the one who said that. So I came out and I took one of my dad's commander's caps and I got a plain cover for it. And I think I stitched on some gold braid around the band and just kind of put this thing together. And I had a trench coat on and came out. Going out by that was my first. I think I was 17 years old. Oh, and I'd gone over to the Naval Air Station North Island to the uniform shop, and they still had the 5-star insignia that you could buy for Fleet Admiral. Fleet Admiral and General of the Army is the same thing. They're identical, and they were sterling silver, and they were $18.95, which means I don't know how I had that much money because adjusted for inflation from 1973 or 72, whenever this was. It's like $100
or a tank of gas, whatever came first.
I still have them, and I still wear them when I do my MacArthur impersonation.
Real quick, I don't want to pass over this. I don't know if the audience heard it. If Jeff caught, his school had a commissioner of PEP.
We had a commissioner of PEP.
I am assuming the commissioner of PEP organized the PEP rallies.
The PEP rallies, the PEP band. And any school assemblies that had to do with school spirit.
Now, when one runs for the commissioner of PEP, is that as rugged and rough as running for the student council president? Or is that
no
step up from AV?
Let's just say it's not as well respected as other commissioners on the board. Well, but it's considered to be important. But it was usually a member of the PEP band. And the PEP band, I don't know why. The PEP band would break into "Mighty Oregon," which was our school song. Whenever there's a touchdown and so forth. It was very, very, dramatic. But I remember there's one guy who played the flute in the pep band. It's like you never heard him because he was completely drowned out. But he just plugged away though. But commissioner of PEP.
That and the fact that you got away with having a corncob pipe in your high school.
Yeah, well, it was a Navy school, and this kind of. Of course, I was always, I was 6'4", so I was pretty hard to miss. So, although one thing I came, which no one appreciated, was that when I came out wearing my trench coat and my sunglasses and pipe and cap, I actually had my pants were wet from the knees down, and I had a couple of strands of seaweed draped around my ankles, and no one got that. No one even noticed it. So,
well, see, that's the foreshadowing of your future of being a living historian and getting it right all the way down to the
every detail. Yeah, the stitch Nazis. Yes.
Well, the other thing you said too, which Jeff and I pointed out in the past, but we don't bring up too much, is the kind of acting side of living historians. You need to be three things to be a living historian. Well, I guess 4, but researcher, first and foremost. Second is a wardrobe department. Third, depending on how deep you want to get and how you want to present yourself at an event, an actor. And, and most a
convincing actor.
And you have to have a bit of a salesman. I tell people to be a living historian is kind of like the guy who works the booth at the trade shows. By the end of the weekend, you've given your spiel, your sales pitch so many times that, you know, after a few years into this, if you're doing the same impression, you're just like that guy who's trying to sell that new computer or that new piece of technology at the trade show who's been there for 2 weeks. You're selling it.
Yeah, I don't know if Jeff told you this, but the first time I appeared at the Pacific Combat Center at the museum I contacted him by email and invited myself. And I had this great. My wife has a cousin who lives 10 miles out of town of Fredericksburg. So it was all under the guise of, well, listen, I'm going to be out there anyway, Jeff. And so I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And he'd never seen me before. So, you know, it's an act of faith on his part.
I kind of did the same thing. I'm like, hey, I'm going to come out and do a podcast. Why don't I bring my uniform? You supply the weapons and I'll participate in the activity. Yeah. So I did the same thing while I'm here. So it was.
I just make the dreams come true.
He's like the Walt Disney for living historians.
I tell people it was like, you know, if you watch Saving Private Ryan, I was like Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg at the same time. It was amazing. Not that I had that kind of talent, but those jobs.
Yeah. When did you participate in your first organized living history event where it was more than just you performing in your wet trousers in front of your high school audience who didn't get
well, actually, we go back ways. There's one character I hadn't mentioned. The actual first after I did MacArthur at the pep rally, it was about 10 years later, and a friend of mine in the local Kiwanis Club, this was up on the Monterey Peninsula, which is just south of San Francisco, knew of my interest in history and knew that my interest in Baden-Powell. Robert Baden-Powell was the founder of the British Boy Scout movement, and he was this very colorful lieutenant general of the British Army. He asked me, he said, would you, you've read about Baden-Powell? I said, yeah, he's really a fascinating character, you know. So he's a cross-dresser, amongst other things. He used to, you know, back, you know, this is not unusual for the British Army. You know, back in the days when they were out in the jungle somewhere, you know, somebody had to play the women part. So apparently Baden-Powell was very good at that. So anyway, so he asked me to come and speak to the Boy Scout troop on Baden-Powell, and this living history group had just come through the Monterey area. And they had, you know, Abigail Adams with them and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and they were a group from Los Angeles. I think they were called the American Living History Theater. I don't think they're around any longer. This must be around 1980, 1981. So it's a few years ago. So my wife and I went and watched this presentation. And I turned to her, I said, you know, I could do that. I mean, I wanted to do that with FDR, and I did that for MacArthur at the end. So I contacted my friend, the Scoutmaster, and I said, why don't I come and talk as Baden-Powell rather than about Baden-Powell? I told him about the living history thing. And so I rushed and put together a uniform and wrote out a script and you know, set the stage. And that was my very first time I did this. Now, interesting story about that is for that presentation, we were going to have a special guest come out from the Carmel Valley, but he had the flu that evening. He couldn't make it. It was General Jimmy Doolittle.
Oh wow!
That was my one chance to meet him, and he couldn't make it. This was several years before he passed on. So it's like, yeah, oh boy, talk about missed opportunities.
Real quick.
So that was probably the first legitimate living history, you know, where I actually wrote it out, did the costuming parts and did those kind of things. And then I went on to that summer. I went on to portray that for a group of Scoutmasters who come from out of state. And then every Friday night I went down into Big Sur to the Boy Scout summer camp, and we did like a fireside presentation where I would walk out of the gloom and do this Baden-Powell thing. I did that for like 6 weeks. And so I probably got observed by like 3,000 scouts over the period of this one summer. So that was it. So,
real quick question. Is that why we're called the Boy Scouts of America? Because it didn't start here?
Yes.
I just assumed like every self-centered American that we created, and it started here. But now that it makes sense.
Well, we had earlier versions. We had what was called the Woodcraft Rangers.
Oh, okay.
And there was another organization whose name I can't think of right now, is basically built on Indian lore. And these two groups kind of did the same thing the Scouts did, but the Scouts were better organized. And the American businessman was over in London in 1910, and he got lost in the fog. And the Scout came upon him and said, "Can I help you, sir?" He said, "Well, I'm looking for this address." He goes, "I know where that. I'll take you there." So he escorted them there, and then the businessman said, "Well, who are you and why are you dressed like this?" And he explained the situation. He said, "If you like, you can come around to," I believe the headquarters is called Guild House, if I remember correctly, and gave him a card. And so this businessman showed up the next day, learned all about scouting, got every bit of information, took it back to the United States, contacted his friends, and within about 6 months, there was a scouting movement in the United States. There was a guy named Thomas, I can't remember now, Seton, I think, Seton, who basically was with the Woodcraft Rangers, and he went to the other side. He thought the scouting thing was just fantastic. So they folded all that in and created this. And of course, I think the American Boy Scouts are probably, just because out of population size, have probably expanded to more than any other country. But it's just really fascinating. In fact, my wife got a scholarship at USC several years later, and she had a World War I history class, and she was asked to write. The students were asked to pick one aspect of the Great War, the First World War, that was unusual, and she talked about what the Boy Scouts had done, for scrap drives and so forth. And she got a very nice comment back that the professor had never seen a paper on this, and how thrilled he was, because it's an aspect he really hadn't considered. So see, my wife actually listens to me. It works both ways.
At what point did the Boy Scouts establish a defined uniform? The reason I ask that is I'm on Wikipedia right now, and I'm looking at, interestingly enough, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio after I left Kentucky. I'm actually looking at a Boy Scout troop in 1918 from Columbus, Ohio.
Oh,
and
boy, yeah. They have the campaign hats, which were called BPs, or Baden-Powells, in honor of him.
Not only that, but their jackets look straight out of World War I. It looks like they all got their father's World War I tunics.
Yeah. They've had a lot of uniform changes. When I was in the Scouts in the mid-1960s, we had this kind of, it was sort of a sage color, long trousers or short trousers, and then either the short sleeve shirt or the long sleeve shirt. And but the knee socks and the shorts were always a very, very big part of that. Interestingly, the uniform that Baden-Powell wore was, and I modified a Marine Corps uniform. It was a Marine Corps style tunic, and the Marine Corps tunic is very similar to the British Army tunic. No epaulets, one of those high Hoover collars, and then of course the shorts and the knee socks and so forth. And it was basically it's what the British call khaki, which is basically olive drab.
Yeah,
it's like it's like a more flattering shade of olive drab, not the suntan, which we think of. But I know the Boy Scouts now have basically gone with what is essentially like a park ranger uniform. It's the dark green shorts and the khaki shirt.
I was in Cub Scouts in the mid '80s. My brother was in Boy Scouts, and by then it was, for all intents and purposes, just the blue or khaki Dickies shirt with some patches on it. I mean, that's pretty much it. You don't have the Dickies logo on it, but it's that normal mechanic style work shirt cut with just pant and short.
Minimum of stitching.
Wonder when the bandana handkerchief came into play.
That was very early on. There are pictures of Baden-Powell wearing that in World War I. And he wore I researched this because back in 2018, the pastor of the church, his son became an Eagle Scout. And so I happened to mention in passing to the pastor's wife, I said, I did a Baden-Powell thing like 35 years ago. So she said, I've got to have you. So I put together this uniform very, very, very quickly, and got a little fake mustache and showed up with this. And but it went very, very well, because as I walked through the congregation, we did this in the sanctuary of our church, and I knew enough about merit badges where I would stop and look at the Scouts and say, well, things haven't changed much since I passed away, and what's this badge here? This is this, and what's this badge over? I don't recognize this one here. So it was very, very, very fun, and it was that uniform was very similar to what they were. Because one of my comments was, well, the uniforms haven't changed much, because there's a picture of Baden Powell. He's wearing dark green shorts and a khaki short sleeve shirt. He's got the blue neckerchief on. So there's some significance to the color. I'm not sure what it was.
So after you did your years at the Boy Scout camps and getting that impression, which is great history, I mean, especially for them. When did your first participation in an organized World War II event come along?
That would have been in 2012, and that was at Fort MacArthur here in Los Angeles. It's Los Angeles Harbor. It's called San Pedro. It's a neighborhood of the city of Los Angeles. And that's an event that it's kind of funny, actually. I first went to the event in the year 2000. I took one of my sons with me. And there was a guy there doing MacArthur. I was about 45 at the time. I'm 69 now. So it was a few years ago. And this guy who was doing MacArthur was probably 70. I thought he was ancient, which is almost how old I am now. And but I was very, very impressed. It's an old coastal artillery fort, of which there aren't that many left. A lot of them have been restored. Fort MacArthur, incidentally, is not named for Douglas MacArthur. It's named for Arthur MacArthur, his father. When they created those forts around 1912, those forts were named for Medal of Honor winners. So and he had been in command of what they call the California Department around 1905, 1906. And he was very much a booster for developing Los Angeles and developing a harbor. So that's why the fort was named for him. So that was the first event I went to in the year 2000. And they've been doing this for about 10 years. And this was like the biggest event, living history event west of the Mississippi. Very, very impressively done. So I talked to this gentleman. His name was Dennis Leslie. He's since passed away. So I went home and put together my costume, my uniform.
Your impression.
Here we go. Yeah, the cap now. And I kept in contact with a few people, and that's the one impression I wanted to do. And he retired in 2012. So I waited 12 years. I'm very patient. But, meanwhile, of course, I've been reading up on MacArthur and so forth. So when he retired, I just moved right in. I contacted, they had a group of Philippine scouts there, and I contacted them, and they didn't know what to make of me. Again, this is where I invited myself, and they kind of thought, who is this guy? There's when you contact people, and Jeff can tell you about this, there's a really fine line between, is this guy a crackpot or is he legitimate?
Sure.
So it's a little hard finding that line sometimes. But they invited me to come along, and they had done a fantastic. They actually had put together a frontline battalion unit for the scouts, and they had artifacts, typewriters, telephones, paperwork, maps, charts. They just did a first-class display, and they were very, very nice. And I went there that first year, and then they invited me back the following year, and I. By 2014, I would do the opening speech when we started the proceedings, because of telling the history of Arthur MacArthur and why the fort was named after him, which was kind of nice. The speech got a little longer every year. Someone sent me a copy, and I realized it was 9 minutes long. I thought, oh my God, that's horrible. So following year, I cut it down to 5 minutes. So that just was too long. But it turned out very, very well about how he got his Medal of Honor. And a lot of people don't know this story unless you're a big fan of MacArthur. But we had that was a marvelous event. The last event was in 2018, and then in 2019 they scaled it back to basically just but we had everybody. We had Roman legionnaires. We had this one guy, he came dressed like a caveman.
So it was a timeline event then.
He had the skins on and a club, and he showed up by 1 year before he came. I knew this guy because he does all different types of impressions. So they weren't going to let me in. I said, well, I tell you what, I'll make an announcement. So when I opened up the proceeding, they said, welcome to Fort MacArthur, named in honor of Lieutenant General Arthur MacArthur. Because I couldn't help but noticing that a caveman is with us today. I said, so there's just a few titters of laughter. And I went on to say something to the effect that what he lacks in verbal skills, he more than makes up in the comfort of his uniform. And so, anyway,
Well, you know,
He got a big kid.
It's interesting because we used to have more when I first started. There's fewer and fewer of them, but we had a few timeline events down here in Florida, and obviously, it being Florida, we'd have a couple people doing their Seminole Indian impressions, and they're just out there in just a loincloth and face paint and just doing the whole thing. And we'd have some people doing the conquistador stuff, and here comes the horses trampling through. I mean, it was cool. We don't have them as much as we used to, which is sad. We really.
I just thought it was just wonderful. In fact, you know, my favorite memory of that whole event, when it's over now, was that there was a little bit of a hill that as the units would march in, and they would mass at the base of the flagpole of the fort where we'd raise the colors, and I gave my little welcome to Fort MacArthur speech. But as the American colonial forces came with their flags flying, they turned that riot. It was absolutely moving experience. Just the color of everything.
Yeah.
But we had all sorts of people. We had Russians toward the last few years. We had Japanese soldiers, Chinese soldiers. It's just absolutely fantastic. And it was a great event, and I'm sorry to see it.
Did 2020 kill it?
I'm sorry?
Did 2020 kill it?
No, actually, it was. There was the fort was run by the LA City Department of the Parks and Recreations. And, there were cannons that were fired. There were a lot of local residents who complained about the noise. So we got more and more. The big thing they do there, and they were going to do it this last year, but they had to cancel, it's the Great Los Angeles Air Raid. Now, if you ever saw the movie 1941, that's actually based on something that actually happened. Apparently, a bunch of weather balloons. Well, let me back up here. In February of 1942, a Japanese submarine attacked a refinery just north of Santa Barbara. They fired a few shells. It did very little damage. Within a couple of days, apparently some weather balloons got loose, and the alarm went up, and people assumed that the Japanese planes were attacking Los Angeles. And they fired over 6,000 rounds, anti-aircraft rounds. And, actually, about 4 or 5 people died, 2 of them from heart attacks and the other from falling debris. But the city was completely panicked. So to honor this event, the fort puts on this thing called the Great LA Air Raid. It's done like the last Saturday of every February. And they have a dance band that comes out. People show up, mostly in civilian clothes, but it's very, very well attended. I'm always there to greet them as General MacArthur when they arrive. And it's right off the Pacific coast. It faces Catalina Island, and because it's February, it's like 40 degrees and the wind's blowing. And so I had invested in long underwear because my thin little khaki uniform wasn't keeping me warm enough. But at the end of the evening, they get this countdown that the announcer comes on and says, we just received word from headquarters that some planes have been sighted, and we're going to go to a yellow alert. And then finally at 9 o'clock, the lights go out, the air raid sirens come on, and they have some incredible air raid sirens from the actual fort from the 1930s. They crank those things up. You feel like you're in London with the Edward R. Murrow. Absolutely, it just makes the hair in the back of your neck stand up. And then they start firing guns off. Well, clearly the neighbors didn't like that very much. It's a coast artillery fort. The actual emplacements are still there. The guns are long gone. They were 16-inch naval rifles, same size that are on board the battleship New Jersey or the battleship Iowa or the Wisconsin or the Missouri. But by the 1930s, they couldn't fire those guns because they would blow all the windows out of the neighbors' homes around the area.
Yeah.
And they were, the city was paying all these thousands of dollars in insurance costs. So the fort was, the neighbors have always been less enthusiastic about it, but it's amazingly intact. And they've been slowly restoring the communication center and some of the tunnels. And to me, it's probably like the closest thing you ever see to the tunnels on Corregidor. I think it's just wonderful. Wonderful group of people who still volunteer down there. It's like, wow. It's really, really a cool event, though. The Great LA Air Raid. We have a new event now, which is a different group of people that it's called the Grand Encampment. And it's kind of doing that same thing. We're inviting people from all different timelines to come. It's being held out in an airport out in Riverside, which is about 60 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. And it's on Veterans Day, so it's around November 10th, November 11th every year. And the weather is absolutely perfect out there because it's like a high of 65. It's usually sunny. So
even in the Inland Empire, it's nice out there.
Oh, you know that term, huh? You've been out here before.
I spent 3 years in Long Beach. So before I moved to Florida, okay. I left Ohio. I lived at walking distance of Cal State Long Beach, right there on Bellflower.
Oh, sure.
But
well, it's this little private airport. It's called Flaybob, and it's named for a couple of guys. And a guy was named Flavio, and a guy named Bob. So it's called Flaybob, and it's not that far from March Air Force Base. Speaking of which, we do a Spirit of 45 event every year. We alternate. We did it yesterday on board the SS Lane Victory, which is a World War II victory ship in San Pedro Harbor. And they pipe MacArthur on board. We have an Admiral Nimitz who comes on board, and Admiral Nimitz gives his speech, which he gave. He broadcast to the nation right after the surrender ceremony on board the Missouri. It's a wonderful speech. And MacArthur it's Douglas MacArthur show. He does basically runs the whole thing. But it's a great event. But we did a similar event a year ago out at March Air Force Base. The hangar was air conditioned. It was 100 degrees outside, August in Riverside. Yeah. So.
We have a Liberty ship in Tampa. It's called the SS American Victory, and it goes out in Tampa Bay. And much like the city of LA, you can't exactly go firing off big old 50 millimeter.
No. In fact, our ship, our Victory ship is inoperable right now. They're having boiler problems, and they have two problems. They don't have enough money to repair it, and they don't have the people to repair it. It's one of those kind of things where it's boiler tubes.
Ours just got out of dry dock. But what I was going to say is how they got around potential damage from the large percussion from the cannons is they would literally just fire off 3 or 4 12-gauge blanks at the same time through the barrels. And it gives it a little bit of boom, but not enough to rattle windows and set off car alarms. And we would float around and shooting up Tampa Bay, and then we would head back, and they'd have a handful of us.
We do the same thing. I have done a couple of those because we go out to Catalina Island, and then we would be attacked by 3 probably T6 trainers painted like Messerschmitts.
Nice.
And then 3 T6 painted like Mustangs would chase them off, and we would fire back at them with our deck guns, which were probably just shotgun shell type of thing. It's all very funny because the captain comes on board the loudspeaker and says, "We think we found a German spy on board. He may have radio our position." So a few minutes later, they bring this guy out. He's dressed up in this Luftwaffe colonel's uniform, and they've got him in irons, and they bring him around the deck. And so,
not a very incognito spy, but
yeah. Full uniform. Well, he doesn't want to be executed for espionage.
As someone who spent 12 years studying MacArthur before you actually got to do your impression live,
well, actually, yeah, but I had been a fan of MacArthur since I was about 18. So really, I've been studying MacArthur for 50 years now. I always knew who he was. When I was working in the library in my senior year in high school, I came across, of all things, a picture book. It's just it was published right after he passed away in 1964. And I remember when he died. I was about 10 years old, and my mother was very upset. But
your father, not so much.
Father's like, oh, yeah, okay. I remember years later, parents were up visiting, and I was wearing a pair of these pleated khaki pants, and my father says, "Oh, you got some of those pleated pants like Dugout Doug used to wear." And I said, "Yeah." Dugout used to wear those things to hide his paunch. You know why he wore those pleats, huh? All these little digs.
Well,
but no. So I had been studying MacArthur since I was. But this is in the early '70s, and I was lucky enough to meet people who who'd either seen him in person, or for example, in 1980, when I was living up in Northern California, I wrote an article for our local newspaper. It was a Sunday feature on the anniversary of his 100th birthday. And the following morning, I walked into this stationery store where I was working part-time. And the store manager, who was a local city councilman, knew my interest in MacArthur, says, "I want you to meet somebody, Bob. Come on over here." He says, "This is General Edwin Wright." And of course, I knew who Edwin Wright was. He was another one of these guys who lived in Carmel Valley. Probably was a neighbor of General Doolittle. And Edwin Wright was in during the Korean War. He was MacArthur's operations officer, and his nickname was Pinky. I don't know, probably know his school name. And so I knew right away who he was. So I said, "Pinky Wright?" Mm-hmm. He was so flattered that some 25-year-old kid actually knew his nickname. So he invited me over to his home, and I sat there with him for like 3 hours talking about MacArthur. And all I wanted to know was, what was he like? What was he like to work for? And I didn't take any notes. I didn't take a paper with me or a pen. I just soaked it out like a sponge. I still remember the conversation. And I just wanted to get an idea. What was he like talking to him? Was he really as dramatic as people, said? I mean, did he pace like people say he paced a lot? I was just trying to get a really sense of what MacArthur was actually like. And he was very, very helpful, very, very observant. A very, very nice man to spend time talking to me about that. So I was lucky enough to meet these people. That was probably the only person I met who actually had worked with MacArthur closely. But I had met people who remember seeing him in parades and so forth. And it was really a really great opportunity. I mean, he'd only been dead for 8 or 9 years when I first got interested in him. So I was very fortunate that way.
As someone who spent all that time studying him and learning everything you can, what's something you can share with our audience that you know that you've discovered about him that's not published in every article, every book, every TV show about the man? What's something maybe you feel that people need to know about MacArthur that isn't shared enough?
2 things: his wisdom and his sense of humor. And yes, he did have a sense of humor. His wisdom, of course, is that, he just had a really good sense of how far you can push people, how to motivate people,
something Pat should learn.
How to manipulate people. But there's a story. One of my favorite stories about him was as they were moving north in 1944 to move up to Hollandia and leave Australia behind. They can move the headquarters, in preparation of actually moving on to the Philippines. A group of the staff officers had put together a large consignment of various alcohol, whiskey, gin, vodka, and they had this all packed up to take with them. But MacArthur was very much a control person. He wants to know everything that's coming up to Hollandia, and he wants to sign off on it. So the staff officers, no one's got the courage to go and ask MacArthur to okay all this, and so they choose MacArthur's personal physician, and he's given the task of asking the question, can we move these spirits up to our headquarters with us? So he asked MacArthur, and MacArthur says, what are the enlisted men drinking? And someone said, beer. He said, okay, well, the enlisted men are drinking beer. I think it's good enough for the officers. So send beer, leave the other stuff behind. So that's a great story. My other favorite story about him was during the Japanese surrender ceremony on board the Missouri. I mean, probably one of the most somber events you can picture. Extremely well photographed in color. There are some marvelous stories about that. And one of them was that when MacArthur was in Manila before the war, you may recall that famous cover in Life magazine, which is his profile, and it says Commander Far East. The date is December 8th, 1941. It was published the week before, as was the custom, but it had that Monday morning date on it. And Claire Booth Luce, the famous playwright and congresswoman, had gone out to interview him the summer before. It was in July of 1941 when he had been recalled to duty. That's why he's wearing that uniform. That's his, new uniform. So she sent along a photographer named Carl Mydans. And Carl Mydans was one of the great life photographers of the Pacific War. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and Pulitzer Prize. And he got to know MacArthur pretty well. He and his wife were both interned in a civilian concentration camp for a year, Santa Tomas in Manila. But he eventually worked out where they got a release, and they went over and they were stationed in Germany. His wife was a correspondent for Life magazine. So he got reassigned back to the Pacific when the Japanese surrendered because he wanted to be on hand for the surrender ceremony. So during the signing of the documents, the representative from Canada, who apparently was suffering from a migraine, signed on the wrong line.
Oh, yeah.
And there was this pause there. It's a famous story. There's a pause there. So Mydans grabs his camera, he runs across the quarterdeck and takes this picture of the document. And these 2 big Marines come over and they pick him up by either arm. They start to carry him off. And as they walk past MacArthur's looking at him, sort of stone-faced, and he gives him this big wink, like, right in the middle of the ceremony. So there's stories like that. And there are other numerous ones that, that it's like when you see MacArthur depicted in film, movies and so forth. 2 things occur to me. One thing, he's always humorless, and there's no, he can be kind of witty. He can make these wry comments about things. That's never shown. He's always very serious and somber. Plus, the fact is, why do they always get guys who look like Irish truck drivers to play MacArthur? You notice that? These big burly guys with big square jaws, and you look at pictures of MacArthur, he looks like he looks almost Mediterranean. His mother was, I don't know, Yeah, he's got this
Kinda
almost
swirly.
Italian. Yeah, you can imagine him wearing a toga, 2,000 years ago. He's got that. He's got this real sensitive look in his eyes, and he's not the kind of guy you think of as being a general. When I think of a general, I think of Pat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's who most Americans think of as not MacArthur. MacArthur would get that kind of steely look, like I'm trying really hard to look tough, but you see him in unguarded moments. He gets really upset looking about stuff. I think he's really high strung. Twitched a lot, hands are always moving type of thing. So those are things that I try to incorporate. I tell stories about MacArthur when we go to various, air shows or events like that. So I want people to try to see the overall picture. And really the best source for all that is just read the memoirs of people who worked with him, his doctor, his pilot. There's a correspondent who worked for CBS named Bill Dunn, who wrote a great account called Pacific Microfilm. And he was there at the fall of Manila, and he came back. He's the guy, when you see them wading the shore at Tacloban in October of 1944, and Jeff, I may have teased you about this. I said, we need this guy wearing civilian clothes. He's carrying a portable typewriter with him. There's this one guy gets off the landing craft. He's got no helmet, no hat. He's got a portable typewriter. That's Bill Dunn. So he's going to write the first story. So he was a marvelous, marvelous source of information. And all these guys, just tell these stories. Another great story was that when MacArthur first arrived in Brisbane, where they were located at the very beginning of the war in March of 42, they didn't put any kind of guard outside the elevator on the upper floors where he and his wife and son lived. So apparently these two drunk sailors came in one night and knocked on the door. MacArthur wasn't there, but his wife answered the door, and they said, well, we wanted to see the general. So they got rid of those guys, and they decided that they needed to put a guard. So they put an army guy up there, and he was some corporal, had a machine gun, sat outside the front door, and he dozed off one night. Yes. And he woke up because he felt something brush past him, and he looked and he saw the door closing. It was back of MacArthur. MacArthur didn't even wake him up. So the guy's probably tired. So MacArthur's headquarters, his frontline headquarters, is that, you show up there and you wouldn't know. I mean, it was completely unlike Pat. I mean, nobody wore ties. MacArthur would walk around wearing like a bathrobe, his West Point bathrobe most of the day. And the guys on guard duty were just sitting around. I mean, it was very, very relaxed. He was not a spit and polish kind of guy. And you kind of get the idea that, he was like Patton. He was the anti-Pat. I mean, Patton was this weird combination of chaos and extreme order. And MacArthur was like really just the opposite. MacArthur was everything was very, very controlled, very contained, but he was very, very relaxed. And I think that's part of his charisma, is that you look at him and physically he's very, very tense. His hands are always twitching and so forth, but he's always very kind of, hey, whatever. I don't get upset about anything. So,
Jeff, you got any questions?
I have his charisma.
Yeah, I got a couple of things. And I mean, first, I guess our listeners are well aware that Robert is very well versed in numerous subjects and the knowledge. You've been talking for about 2.5 days straight. So it's been unbelievable absorbing all of this information.
I've never seen Jeff so quiet.
But no, two things. I want to go back and talk about your wife, and we're going to do that in a minute, because it really plays with. But it really plays in the things that we talk about a lot on the show with reenacting and the support. But no, what I'd like to do before we go back to your wife, though, I'd like to kind of the impression that you said that your dad had of General MacArthur. I feel like that's the overall majority, right? Oh, that's Dugout Doug and this and that. And I just doing a little bit of research before coming on tonight, because I don't have an opinion either way. I thought he was a great general. Anybody that served in the Army for 52 years is probably doing something right.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of superlatives. There's a lot of superlatives that are attached to MacArthur's name that I had no idea. And I think, when we just throw out Dugout Doug out there as World War II historians or, people who think they know something about the man, if we really go back and look and really what he accomplished, just prior to the First World War and then what he did with the 42nd Infantry Division, I did not know that he was responsible for the Rainbow Division. That's an unbelievable.
He was chief of staff. He put it together, and he Yeah, he was one of these kind of guys. He's always got the best people he could find for his staff people. And
well, he wasn't chief of staff at the time, I didn't think. That's what really,
no,
because he became the division commander.
Yeah, he was the division commander very, very briefly, just right after the war, just for a few days. In fact, he was put in for major general because that's the rank for a division. And when the unit was first formed in 1917, the summer of 1917, he was made chief of staff. He was a Corps of Engineer guy. You know, the top 10% of the West Point grads would automatically go in the Corps of Engineers because they're the smartest. And he was an engineer for the first 15 years after he graduated. He went to the general staff in 1912 and stayed on there and worked with Leonard Wood and people like this. Leonard Wood's a very interesting, huge influence on MacArthur. He and MacArthur's father were his two big mentors. Neither of them West Point graduates, and really guys who were kind of outside the mainstream, as MacArthur was. I mean, MacArthur is like, you know, when you look at people like Fox Connor or Marshall or Eisenhower or Patton, you know, these guys they're all part of the Army establishment. They go through all those service schools, you know, command and control and Army War College. They do all those things that, you know, if you're going to go for a high rank, you have to do. MacArthur didn't do any of those. The only postgraduate course MacArthur ever took was an engineering course at Leavenworth, I think in 1911. And then he came back the following year and taught that course again for other students. But he never went to any of the postgraduate schools. He didn't do those things you're supposed to do for high rank because he didn't need to. I mean, he already knew this stuff. He was really,
and I think
he was basically homeschooled. He was a homeschooler, I mean, essentially what they call an autodidact. He created his own staff arrangements, and it goes back to what I said earlier about he was a very wise person, great deal of wisdom. I mean, he basically knew what he needed to do. And when I went back to get my master's degree, what I wrote for my senior thesis was his reforms at West Point when he was superintendent there in 1919, 1922. And this is where you really see it, because he's figuring, you know, like most guys, there's another war coming in 20 years. It's going to be with Japan and probably Germany. We need to be ready for it. We're going to be occupiers. So what do we need to do? We need to change the curriculum here because we're still studying the Civil War. So immediately they start studying the Great War. That's the first thing they do. And he wants to expand the history and English department are one department at West Point. He wants them separated, and he wants a course put in with applied psychology. He didn't get that. That wouldn't happen until after World War II. He says, you know, 99.5% of all the men who served in World War I were civilian draftees. 0.5% were West Point graduates or regular Army. And that was his whole plan for the Rainbow Division, going back to see, because at the time, when they talked about, you know, let's send the regular Army over there, which is what, 170,000 men in 1917. And MacArthur says, no, we can't squander those people. You know, those are people they're the intellectual embodiment of the Army. They're the ones who are trained. We need to get those people to train civilians. But we have to understand that we can't treat civilians like they're soldiers. We've got to treat them with a certain amount of dignity and respect. So that was his big takeaway. And so when he became superintendent at West Point, and he's, you know, wanted to put in these educational reforms, he was not particularly successful in any of it. He was pretty much stonewalled the entire way. He was able to make some changes, but not all of them. Plus, they kicked him out a year early because Pershing didn't like what he was doing there. But regardless, he understood that future wars, it was going to be civilian army. He, as his father and also Leonard Wood, had a very high opinion of civilian soldiers. He said, but you've got to treat them like a civilian. He has a great quote. He says, you can lead them, but you can't bully them. And he once said to his chief of staff at West Point, he said, I wonder how many of our guys were shot in the backs by civilians who just didn't like these SOBs. You know, it's like, wow. So yeah, it goes back to, you know, his whole concept of what is wisdom, and, you know, you have to, you know, he's very pragmatic. You know, he's not an ideologue. You know, he's not liberal. He's not conservative. He's just somebody that says what works. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, it's like if you're going to talk about, say, universal health care in the United States, for example, whatever your opinion of that is. If a person can say, if we can prove to the American public and to Congress that we'll actually save money ensuring everybody that why not do it because it makes more sense. If your concern is it costs too much, if we can show we can save money doing this, let's do it. See, that would have been, if MacArthur had been president in the 1950s, that would have been his approach, because he didn't care about, the ideology behind something. It's like, if it works or it doesn't work. I mean, in the broad sense, clearly, it's like his reforms in Japan after World War II. But that's a whole different topic.
Now, as you can see behind Jeff, I'm going to impress Jeff real quick. Watch this. As you can see behind Jeff, he's got the February 13th, 1956 edition of the Life magazine featuring General MacArthur.
Is that where he's leaning against the mantelpiece in his looks like his study or his living room?
No, it's the one with
he's shaking Truman's hand. It's when MacArthur had the chance to make his rebuttal and him being relieved of command.
Oh yeah. I think it's because I think Truman's memoirs had just come out. I believe that's what had happened.
Well, the reason I bring that up is MacArthur was apparently loved by Life magazine. He was on probably
Henry Luce
7 or 8 covers, and not only was he, and Jeff didn't see this. You recognize this young chap?
Oh yeah.
I actually have the Lifetime magazine from August 3rd, 1942. Jeff, that is young. That's MacArthur's son. That is young Arthur MacArthur, which I know now is named after his grandfather, because when I first saw it, I was like, why would MacArthur name his son Arthur MacArthur? But now we know it's named after his father. But apparently, I was going to say that someone over Lifetime magazine had a real love for MacArthur, because I looked up quickly. I think he's on 6 or 7 different covers, not to mention his son and then his hat. His hat's on a hat rack.
Yep.
So they were
huge
fans of him.
I'll tell you a funny story about that hat on the hat rack too someday, when we have more time, because that's not his actual hat. That's a hat that the War Department made up, or the Pentagon made up in 1961 for him to wear when he went back to the Philippines to commemorate the 15th anniversary. And they did that because his actual hat was so badly deteriorated it was falling apart. I was at the museum, the MacArthur Museum Memorial, back in 2018. I have a passing acquaintance with the archivist there. We've emailed back and forth. So I was back for a parade in Washington, the Memorial Day parade. It's MacArthur. And Norfolk is only about 3 hours away. In fact, I lived there as a kid when I was 5 or 6. My dad was stationed there. So we went down there, and then we met with the archivist friend of mine and the curator. And they actually have one of MacArthur's khaki uniforms there. So they actually pulled it out. It's in this like file drawer, like you see for blueprint plans. They pulled it out. It was just absolutely amazing. And I was realizing how many of the details I'd gotten right just by looking at photographs. But to see it actually was quite interesting. But he brought out the cap that's hanging on the coat rack on the cover of Life magazine. It's beautifully done, but you can tell because the visor is has a much shorter visor, which was the current Army style by the 1950s and 60s. And apparently the story is that the Pentagon had somebody make that cap up for him, and he wouldn't wear it. He wore his original cap, which had a much bigger visor on his cap.
Yeah, it seemed like the crown was a lot taller too on the original.
Yeah, interesting about the cap is that, and a lot of people don't realize this, is that his cap was basically just the 1902 dress officer's cap, which is still being worn today. It's in blue, not navy blue, it's Army blue. It's actually not black, it's actually a blue color. But it's got the oak leaves that go around the band and the badge and so forth. And that cap was authorized for general officers in 1902, still being worn today. And what MacArthur did was, when he became Field Marshal of the Philippine Army in 1937, he wrote back to his hat maker in New York and said, make me up a cap that make it in khaki cotton, so I can wear it every day. So a lot of people talk about how MacArthur's cap was, custom made, which it was, but it was specially designed by him, which it wasn't. It was just a standard general's cap, made it in a different material. It's kind of silly. It's like wearing a seersucker top hat. It's kind of silly.
Sure. Well, I mean, it worked for him, and it's become his trademark next to the pipe and the aviators.
Here again, the whole spit and polish patent thing. Here's MacArthur's cap, and if you have gold braid, you put it on the tropics. Within about 3 days, it goes green. I mean, because of the humidity. And that cap was looking pretty mingy after the PT boat ride to Mindanao when they left Corregidor. when they evacuated Corregidor. It got drenched with seawater and it was looking pretty nasty. About 8 years ago, the MacArthur Memorial decided they were going to mount a new display because the actual cap had been sitting flat on the surface, and over time, the cap, it gets kind of flattened. So they had a new display they were in. So this local news station came and covered it for us, like an 8-minute thing. It's on YouTube. You can pull up. And so they got the cap, and I'm looking at it, and it's absolutely amazing because there's this huge. It's all this here is all sweat stained. This is all dark in here underneath the cap here, and it's just, he wore a thing for 15 years.
Yeah, I'm looking at a
Yeah.
colorized photo of him, and I don't think it was colorized. I think it was shot in color. It's just a photo. It's talking about World War I, World War II, and Korean War. And yeah, underneath, right on at the bottom of the eagle, it's just a completely different color, brown.
Sweat stains.
It's definitely.
So the story goes, according to one of his aides, by 1950, just before the Korean War, apparently his wife made some comment because there was a big sweat stain on the crown of the cap because there's no lining there because it's too warm in the tropics. So his wife said, she called him General. She said, General, you got to do something about that cap. And so he called him his aide, a guy named Sid Huff. And Sid Huff writes about this in his memoirs. He comes in one day and says, Sid, Jeannie says I need to recover the top of my cap. So can you take care of it for me? And he said, yes, sir. How soon do you need it back? He said, well, I can give it to you tonight. I need it back tomorrow morning.
No rush.
So that night, Sid goes home back to his quarters. He digs through, and of course these staff off, they all have their uniforms custom made when they're in Japan. So he finds a shirt that's a similar color to the cap, and he tracks down this tailor who apparently was a tailor to the royal family and to the high military officers. And he takes it into him and says, "We've got to cover this tonight. You've got to work tonight to do this." And the Japanese tailor, he goes, "No, it's going to fall apart if I touch it." So what they did was they just took a piece of acetate and they cut a circle on it. They put that down on top, and then they cut out the shirt, put it down, and he just hand stitched. They just laid right over the top, and they just slowly hand stitched the whole thing on top of that. And
so it's more of a replacement shell than an actual.
Yeah, it was actually just a replacement of that. So when you see the cap at the Memorial in Norfolk, the top looks pretty good, but the rest of it looks pretty bad. So, and it's kind of when it happened because there's a newsreel of him leaving his headquarters. It's January of 1950. So this is 6 months before the Korean War. It's his 70th birthday. And all these Japanese students, little boys and girls, are lined up there and they're waving American flags and they're singing happy birthday to him in Japanese. And he comes out and he stops, he takes his hat off, and he doffs his hat to them. He sees a big sweat stain on the top. So that's before Jeannie and MacArthur said anything to him about it. So, but poor Sid Huff, he had to rush over and probably sat up all night with the tailor, make sure everything gets screwed up. And then he had to run the hat back to the embassy where they lived. So the following morning when MacArthur left, he had his hat there. So interestingly about that, he had a green wool cap made up, which appears in a couple of pictures, and it looks identical to the khaki one, except it's done in OD. And it's on display at the Pentagon. There's a MacArthur corridor at the Pentagon. It belongs to the MacArthur Memorial Museum, but they have it on permanent loan at the Pentagon. And he only wore that a couple of times. Apparently, after the PT boat ride, his cap shrunk. So he had this green version made up, which he wore a few times. And then Sid Huff, the long-suffering aide to General MacArthur, took the original cap back to New York when he went back to Washington to meet with the people in the Pentagon. And they had the cap stretched out, rebuilt, brought it back. So, I love stuff like that. That's the stitch Nazi in me. So.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, you do another unique impression that I think deserves some quality time spent on it. You want to explain to our audience how you got involved in one of your second primary, or your secondary impression that you do?
Yeah. FDR?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, having parents who grew up in the Depression, hearing all these stories about FDR, and I saw a clip of FDR when I was in high school, and it was he just reminded me of somebody in my family. This was MacArthur also. You find people just it's like he reminds you of an uncle. And there's a quality about FDR. He's it's some footage of where he's being interviewed for a newsreel, and the camera keeps running, and they're talking and say, "Well, Mr. President, we want you to turn your head this way." And he says, "Oh, like this?" And he's just real. It's like he's like somebody you know. Yeah. And of course, that was the appeal. People talked about during his famous fireside chats. They felt like he was talking directly to them. You know, in acting, if you go to school in England to learn acting, as my wife did, which is what they call technical acting. It's not method. It's just the opposite. They actually you intellectualize everything. They have what they call first, second, and third circle. And for example, if you're John Gielgud or Ralph Richardson or Laurence Olivier and you're on stage and you're doing a third circle, you're talking to everybody in the theater. But first circle is you're talking to one person in the front row. And FDR had that ability where to talk to people. It's like, oh, you know, FDR was the first president who really brought informality to the White House. So if you were to meet with President Hoover right before Roosevelt became president, he would say, he'd call you Mr. Abernathy the entire time. FDR would say, "Well, I'm delighted to meet you, Don." And he'd go right to the first name. And a lot of people didn't like that. They weren't used to it because it's too informal, especially for the 1930s and forward. But he had that ability just to connect directly with people. Which, you know, we talk about Ronald Reagan being the great communicator, but, you know, a lot of people when Reagan was president said, well, you know, he's like FDR that way. But FDR really started that out. So FDR was somebody who was really kind of familiar. But the other thing FDR has going for him is he's funny. He's charming. He has a great sense of humor. He was known for quips, which is these like one-line comments. And he was irreverent. Probably one of my favorite stories of that was in the mid-30s. You know, and back in those days, as they do now, they would have the annual convention of governors where all the governors from all the states would come and meet with the president. They'd have conferences and so forth. So FDR had arranged to have a meeting with 6 of the New England governors, and they all showed up for breakfast the following morning. And he forgot about it. He looked up from his Oval Office. He looked around and said, "Oh, whoa, you're not all here to secede from the Union, are you?" Apparently, none of those thought it was very funny, but he just had that way of just kind of, you know, connecting with people. So, and he's just a natural born leader. And he was somebody that that was really the first impression I ever wanted to do was FDR. I tried to convince our school to put on a marvelous play called Sunrise at Campobello, which the drama department thought was totally inappropriate for the school. It was made into a movie in the 1960s with Ralph Bellamy and Greer Garson playing Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, why you would get one of England's most beautiful actresses to play Eleanor Roosevelt, I have no idea. But they gave her the fake teeth and everything. But it's about his battle with polio and how he overcame that over a 3-year period. And so I thought it'd make a great play. It's very inspirational. Of course, I wanted to be cast as part of the FDR.
I'm going to put you on a spot here to prove a point.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about Stitch Nazi all night and authenticity. What year and model was his wheelchair?
Oh, FDR's?
Yeah, what year and model?
He didn't have a model year. He had 4 wheelchairs.
There you go.
He had one at Hyde Park. Well, he had 2 at Hyde. He had one at Hyde Park. He had one at his what they call Top Cottage. He had one at Warm Springs and one in the White House. And Jeff, did I send you a picture of the one I mocked up? Did I send those pictures to you?
Yeah.
So what we did, and of course, you know, if I can adapt something that's available and make it look like it's authentic, I will do that first. My MacArthur uniform that's Dickies pants and a Carhartt shirt, which are heavily tailored.
Well, interestingly enough, I brought this up in the past. Dickies did make uniforms back there, and their modern day stuff hasn't changed that much. There might be a slight different angle on the pockets, you know, the
shirts are. You know, the work shirts is that they have one seam. They're not double stitched, and any of the seams are not double stitched. They have a one-piece collar. They don't have the banded collar. Carhartt had those, and I bought a bunch of Carhartt shirts, and I had a tailor actually modify them with the more pointed collar with a little flap on the collar. And he had one of those little Western yoke things in the back of his shirt. It's like a little arch like you see with Western shirts, and which I didn't know about until I saw his actual uniform when I was in Norfolk. And he had elbow patches on them. They were the same color as material, things like that. But no, FDR's wheelchairs were the kitchen chair, and he had a local blacksmith put together some bicycle wheels on a metal frame. They painted it all black. So for my wheelchair, I found an existing foldable wheelchair. Now, the type of wheelchairs you see now that fold up with the vinyl seat and the vinyl back, they were made by a company called Everest and Jennings, and that foldable wheelchair goes back to 1934 or 1936. Very, very spoke wheels. So I found one of those. Guy was selling them. He had like 20 in his garage. So the idea was I wanted something that was foldable so I could put it in the back of my car and take it with me. Otherwise, if I had a full-size wheelchair, I have a little Hyundai. It wouldn't fit in my car. So we adapted that. So, he had the little wheels in the back, which are in the front. So we just turned the chair around. Now, the problem is with modern wheelchairs, they're tilted so the back of the seat is lower than the front so people don't slide out. So when you turn the chair around, it's just the opposite. You slide right out of it. So we had to put in some springs in the front to do that. And I painted it all black, and my wife refinished the kitchen chair. So
yeah, I'm looking at a photo of it now. I did a really, really good job, because that's what I was going to say. That's when you're doing an impression, depending on what impression it is, there's one piece of that impression that's required. This is a particular one that's you're not going to pick up at the front or World War II impression. So
I have a friend from church who this guy is, we call him MacGyver because he can make anything. He's the kind of guy you want in your life over the cruise ship sinks. I mean, he can do anything. The kind of guy who takes a belt buckle and uses the buckle to make a fishing hook, those kind of guys. So I approached him about 5 years ago. I said, I need some FDR leg braces. And so he got on. He went right to the FDR library website, and not only did he find pictures of what the leg braces look like, but he found a purchase order copy from 1926 from FDR's physician to a place that actually makes these, and they were aluminum, which surprised. He said, I didn't know they were using aluminum. So he calls me up and said, now this is a guy who's about 10 years older than I am. He says, Robert, do you think we should use slotted screws heads or Phillips? I'm not sure, because they had both of them in 1926. So,
that's a good question. And then it's like,
I think we went slotted, because that's kind of like, a lot of it you have to kind of go by feel too. It's like, well, what looks more old-fashioned? It might have technically been accurate, but it's like when you do an impression, you go to Google Image and you pull up the first 10 pictures and you go, okay, that's what people expect to see, type of thing. And so, you want to educate people, but not to the extent where, it's not organic. So,
I guess the question is were those screws reset into nut search, or were they using square head nuts? And then, then what the comfort level is on that.
I didn't want to go there with him.
Yeah.
You figure that out. So no, I've had to glue a few of them. I carry extra screws with me. Now, the actual braces that he wore actually went up to below his armpits.
Wow.
It's like an ectoskeleton that he wore under his clothes. That's what kept them upright. So ours just go up to, I wish I sent a picture of those, but ours go up just below the knee, and they have a leather strap there. We put them in there. So when you're sitting there. Now, what's interesting is that he didn't wear the leg braces when he was in the wheelchair, because he didn't need them. The wheelchair was designed, those 4 wheelchairs, to get him from his desk to he'd go over to a sofa or to a chair. The wheels were actually a little bit lower than the seat, so he could slide right off and put himself onto another chair, like an armchair or something like that. So and of course, nobody ever saw him. No member of the public ever saw him in a wheelchair. And but the braces were there so he could appear to walk. And of course, he could not walk. And there's a marvelous account written by a polio patient named Gallagher, who wrote this about 40 years ago. It's called The Splendid Deception, about how FDR basically did this. And so he'd have these braces on, and he'd lock them in place, and he would hold on to somebody like his son or a large aide, and he'd have a cane in the other hand. And by moving his torso back and forth, he could appear to walk. He's just sliding one leg forward and then the other leg. There's no walking at all, but the braces give the impression that he could actually walk. So you hear some people say, well, he hid the fact that he had polio, didn't he? I said, well, no, everybody knew he had polio. He got polio in 1921. He just run for vice president and lost. And his polio was covered by all the major newspapers of the day. I mean, he was big news. He was a former vice presidential candidate. He just lost the election like 8 months before. But most people who got polio fully recovered. Majority of people who got polio would fully recover. Some would have some difficulty. Some would have partial lameness. Some could have permanent paralysis, some would die. But the amount of people who had what FDR suffered was very rare. I mean, I know people who are a little older than I am who had, my mother-in-law had polio in 1950, 4 years before the vaccine got, and she has weakened back muscles. Fellow I used to work with at church, our church custodian, he talks like that because it affected his vocal cords. That's where it affected him. I mean, it could affect any part of your body. But with FDR, it was classic paralysis. I mean, and when he first contracted polio, he had trouble actually lifting his arms. That passed, but it basically settled in where he could not move his legs. So people thought that he had polio, but everybody knew he had polio. They just did not know to what extent.
Sure.
People assumed he was somewhat lame. He was partially lame, but no, he couldn't walk at all.
Now you brought up Eleanor Roosevelt earlier.
Yes.
Was she like the first real first lady? I mean, we know she gave her weekly speeches. Can you think of a first lady prior to Eleanor Roosevelt who had an impact on the citizens of the United States like Eleanor did? Or was she like the real first lady?
Not directly, no. The first ladies that come to mind are Edith Wilson, who was Woodrow Wilson's second wife. And she's been called the first female president because he was incapacitated by a stroke. And I think that's been overblown. I think she was a gatekeeper, and she conspired with Wilson's doctor, Dr. Cary Grayson. And they decided what they would bring to the president's attention. Now, it's interesting because you have an incapacitated president, like what happens? Well, our Constitution is an amazing document because a lot of the Constitution doesn't tell you what to do. I mean, it's very, the Constitution of the United States is very vague.
But they do have provisions that,
there's a big question now about if former President Trump if he's convicted as a felon, can he not run? No, he can still run for president. He can pardon himself. There are all sorts of things he can do because, or the whole electoral college. I mean, it's very, very vague. I mean, each state has its own requirements, which is really kind of, for my way of thinking, it's really kind of strange for if you're having a presidential election, a federal election, then you think it would be more standardized. But no, every state can how they winner take all or 51% or whatever. So the Constitution is very vague that way. One of the things in the Constitution was that if a bill comes before the president, he doesn't sign it, in 10 days it becomes law. It works. And that's what happened when Wilson was incapacitated. He was incapacitated for the last 19 months of his administration. It was a huge period of time. But, the country went on. It's kind of like that old joke about Calvin Coolidge when he was out on the presidential yacht. They were on the Potomac one summer afternoon, and he dozed off, as he often did. So he wakes up, and there are a group of people, and they're all staring at him. He says, "What? Country still here?" Yeah, the country was still there.
Yep.
So Edith Wilson, but she was not somebody who people really knew. Probably our most accomplished first lady was probably Lou Henry Hoover. She was the first female graduate of Stanford University in 1895. She graduated with Herbert Hoover, and they were both from Iowa, though they didn't know each other when they were living in Iowa. And she was the first woman in America to receive a degree in geology. She was a geologist, and I don't think we've ever had a first lady who did that. But she was very influential with the Girl Scouts, but she was not a public figure in the sense that she was. Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't trying to be a role model so much as Eleanor Roosevelt was. She felt a need to connect with with a lot of women and disenfranchised people in the United States. So she had her column, which is really amazing. She wrote that thing every day from 1935 until she died in 1962. Just remarkable. Now, yesterday when we had our little Spirit of 45 event on board the Late Victory, Eleanor Roosevelt delivered, actually in her column, My Day, she wrote that. And it was really quite an amazing speech. And my wife recited, my wife came as Eleanor Roosevelt yesterday. She's got the Eleanor Roosevelt eyes. And she recited the speech, and it's funny. She turns to me afterwards. She says, have either of you seen the new Barbie movie by any chance?
No.
I'm guessing no, but no, okay. It's about empowerment. Her speech could be right out of that Barbie movie. It's just I have seen it. I have not seen Oppenheimer yet, but I've seen Barbie.
No, I got dragged out to the last voyage of the Nemir this weekend, so my weekend was all about vampires.
But she talks about the fact that women are going to have to help men adjust to peacetime, and the women and so forth. But the fact that women have to work together for world peace, type of thing. It was just a remarkable thing. She's just a remarkable person. It's just my favorite quote of her. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's the point I wanted to make earlier. No. No. But I'm talking about Mrs. Tidwell here for a minute, because very few reenactors that I know of. I mean, I know my wife participates with me, but we don't have a specific couple that we portray as living historians. She's got a few uniforms, and I always kind of like to laugh. I do a lot of, as you know, Robert, I do a lot of 8th Air Force stuff, so I like to think of her as she's English anyway, and I thought maybe get her a waif uniform one day. She does a great English accent. But she's got a few American.
Your wife is English?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, she's Texan first, but she's mostly English. Right. But a lot of other reenactors.
Yeah, no, it's a
yeah, a lot of other reenactors don't always have that kind of support.
No, I know like 4. I think I know, one who's really involved, but other than that, and maybe 2 other guys whose girlfriends show up and just put on a dress, but they don't actively, participate. So it is rare.
Right. But let's give it up for Mrs. Tidwell. To portray Eleanor Roosevelt and the things that she does, the pictures you sent that we're going to share with our listeners, this week.
I wish I had put it. She's absolutely wonderful, and she's got the voice down, and she's a gifted actress to begin with. She's actually trained as a director. She actually went to one of the major drama schools in London back in the mid-70s. It's called Robert Douglas. It's not well known. It's not like the Royal Academy, but people like Angela Lansbury went there, Stuart Granger, Donald Pleasant. Julian Fellows, the guy who wrote Downton Abbey. I hate that guy because he's really trite, but but he does know how to entertain. He's a Weber Douglas graduate. So she went there, but her real gift is directing. So when I do my MacArthur stuff or my FDR stuff, I'll run it past her and I say, what do you think? And she says, well, you need to punch this part up. You need to emphasize this part over here. So you need somebody that's got to sound off. So she's very helpful that way. But there's no advice I can give her to do Eleanor. She just nails it. She just has that ability. And acting is interesting because it's not just about sincerity. It's technical. You got to project. You got to enunciate. There are, it's like it's like being a gifted artist. It's like if you can't decide which colors to use or how to hold a paintbrush, you can't. You can have the most imagination in the world. But to be an effective actor, you really have to get the technical aspects down. The clarity of voice, sincerity. It's a lot of different things. And of course, she was training the British method, which is called technique. So,
our friend Tony over at WLVN 1940s Radio commented on our YouTube channel. Interesting thing I've read about FDR, he was more scared of fire than assassination. He would often leave his door unlocked in case of a fire and would practice rolling out of bed and crawling across the floor to get to the door.
There are 2 reasons for that. He had a cousin who actually died of burns. Something happened. I think the paraffin. This was when he was a child. This was, I think, when he was around 7 or 8 years old. It was the 1880s, and I'm not sure if he was in the same household at the time, but the cousin had a paraffin lamp and it exploded, and again it just set her whole front of her dress on fire. And then, of course, when he developed polio, he was helpless. I mean, he couldn't walk. So he had 2 things going there. So yeah, he was absolutely. In fact, there's a very famous quote about that. The first night that they're in the White House, March 4th, 1933. He's saying goodnight to Eleanor, and he's already been lifted into bed and so forth. He said, all my life I've been afraid of fire. But tonight, I'm afraid that I won't be able to do this job. And she said, no, everything's going to be fine. So, I mean, that was the only time he actually talked about that. But as far as, not being able to be an effective president. But, that was constant. And, I don't know about you guys, but fear of fire is not big on my list of fears. I'm more afraid of burglars. But
well, see,
for a lot of people,
I grew up in
yeah.
I grew up in the early '80s, and I was filled with an unreasonable fear of quicksand because it was on every TV show and every movie growing up. But I've yet to come across quicksand, so I guess I can just mark that fear off my list.
Yeah, yeah. I only learned recently it's just water. You just lie back and you can float on. You can float on it.
Yep. Stop
So
struggling.
why did if I knew that when I was 10 years old, I would have probably slept better at night. But yeah, but a fear of fire. I mean, that was a huge common fear for people in the in the 19th or 20th century type of thing. It's
sure. I mean, when your light was oil lamps and candles.
Oh yeah, candles. Yeah. Christmas trees with candles all over them. That's something amazing.
Yeah,
it's just
boy, I hate to be the one whose responsibility it was to water the Christmas tree that day.
Yeah. No, just someone I came across a quote just on Facebook the other day. We're talking about FDR. I'm on several different Facebook pages, and sometimes people can just write one sentence. Some woman had written, "A crippled man taught the nation how to run." But yeah, it's like the story of Seabiscuit, the horse, who had issues, and it's like we have the nation is crippled, and we elect a crippled president to get us out of it. It's just it's amazing. I mean, you can say what you like about FDR. You can call him a communist, a socialist. This is a courageous man, and he never, with the exception of the first couple of years after he contracted polio in 1921, he would take off in the summer. He'd go on a houseboat down in Florida every summer for 3 years. And they went down there just basically to mourn, I think, just to mourn the loss of his legs. But within a short period of time, he discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, and he was just always. And my favorite, we did this great thing. Speaking of first ladies, every February I'm involved at the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda. It's only about 40 miles from here, and we go out there and my wife and I perform as Franklin and Eleanor. And recently they've been adding this feature where it's the president and the first ladies. So these are not spouses, but people come out and usually we have George Washington, we have General Grant, we have President Lincoln, and myself. And actually, I take that back. President Lincoln's wife comes as Mary Todd Lincoln. So he's another one of those exceptions, I think. But Eleanor is interesting because we'll often stand by the front door when people come into the library. And they'll look at me like I'm chopped liver, and they go, "It's Eleanor." They go right to Eleanor, So this group so we were doing this on the 4th of July. We had a little event at the Nixon Library, and so Eleanor had her table next to my table, and I had recreated his desk at the Oval Office because he had all these knickknacks on it. Very interesting. Kids love dial telephones because they've never seen one before. But people would come in. This family came and they talked to me for about 5 minutes. They moved down to Eleanor's table, and they're there for half an hour. It's just.
Well, once again, in those environments, it's male dominant. War history, politicians. It's men. And as we were talking, with the exception of a few, Eleanor was the first, female kind of role model in that position.
And she was always pushing the envelope. I mean, she is the definition of woke.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about it, because she was saying, what about these people? Right after Pearl Harbor, or in February of 1942, when Roosevelt signed his 9066 executive order to incarcerate the Japanese, I'll tell you a funny story about that. She wanted to move the Japanese family into the White House to show her support, and she got talked out of it very quickly. But she was always doing things like that. Marilyn Anderson, the African American contralto who wanted to sing at the Constitution Hall, the DAR, which ran said no, we were segregated, so they arranged for her to sing in the steps of the White House or the Lincoln Memorial. But I was doing an event at Fort MacArthur in 2018. It was on we had Churchill and we had Stalin. This guy doing Stalin was wonderful. And so people are coming up and asking us. It was an anniversary of the Tehran Conference in Iran, 1943. And someone came and asked me about the internment of the Japanese American citizens. And FDR never, ever, the only thing he ever said about was that we cannot let anything interfere with war production on the West Coast. That's the only thing he ever said. Didn't justify it. And so I quoted that, and I said, and I think we have to realize that you Californians do not have a good track record with your relations with Asiatics. And that just stops right there. Because everybody goes, oh, yeah, that's right. Because, the 1906 decision from the San Francisco Board of Education, there were like six or 12 Japanese students who wanted to enroll in public school. And the school district said no. So they eventually built a separate classroom for them. I mean, it's just amazing. It's just
and people look at it through the eyes of modern day. And I'm looking at my library and I can't see the book, but I was reading a book like The Sons of the Pacific or something. But it was about the second generation Japanese American citizens who went through fight in the army. But what they're talking about, and what a lot of people don't realize, and which I didn't even realize until I read this book, is the civilian population on the islands of Hawaii. There were more first and second generation Japanese than there were Anglos and or even indigenous Hawaiians.
And I'm sure they mentioned why they did not intern those people.
Yeah,
because they couldn't. They didn't have the room, and they didn't have the manpower to process the pineapple.
And furthermore, in California, the Japanese population was rather large too. And so when you're stressing out, you're dealing with a situation, as we've experienced multiple times since then. There's people who make knee-jerk reactions. I'm not defending it, but
no, absolutely.
The internment thing is kind of, people are looking at it through 2023 eyes, not so much 1941, 42 eyes.
People were terrorized.
Yeah.
And the California Army commander guy whose name is John DeWitt, who's a classmate of MacArthur's, had really pushed on this. And J. Edgar Hoover had talked to Roosevelt about this several times, saying there's absolutely no evidence that the Japanese Americans or their parents are disloyal. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not doing anything in Hawaii where using your logic, we should, but we're not doing anything over there because it's not realistic. So why are we doing it here?
Yeah.
There's no indication that it should be done. I think part of it too was I think there was a concern about war hysteria. And I think, and maybe, and this is just conjecture on my part, maybe FDR was concerned about the fact that because how many troops do we want to use to protect people against vigilantism when they can be doing other things? So maybe.
And I'm sure there was a lot of people in the good old boy network at that time interested in land grab, because we know not only were they interned, but their property was stolen. And that in and of itself is disgusting. I mean,
well, they didn't seize it, but they basically made it in such a way where they couldn't pay the mortgages and they went into foreclosure.
Yeah.
Now, some people, there were some, Anglos who were friends of Japanese Americans who actually made the payments, kept the property in that family. But that was very rare, few and far between. But there was no provision for that. I mean, the government could have put a moratorium on, or the government could have paid for it.
Yeah.
So we'll pay. You're giving them 48 hours to vacate. I mean, can you imagine, the army coming up to your house and saying, "Well, you got 48 hours to leave because we don't know when you're coming back." I mean, you just have to kind of put yourself in that position. Think about what that was like.
There was a very
prominent. Then you have the 442nd Infantry. The Nissan. The highest proportion, highest casualty rate proportion, highest major decorations for bravery. Daniel Inouye, the senator from Hawaii.
There was a very prominent rock band that came out in the late 90s. They're popular up until the lead singer passed away a few years ago, called Linkin Park. And the keyboardist of that is Japanese descent. And he had a side project called Fort Minor, and they put out a song called Kimji, and it was about his grandparents who went through the internment camp. And at the beginning of the song, they're talking about them showing up and you having 20 minutes to shove whatever you can in a garbage bag. And it's not only is it interesting, but it's very cool historically to have, I say modern day, even though it's 20 years old now, but to have a modern day song given the viewpoint of what happened through the ancestors and the people who were there in a modern day musical format was very cool for the time. And it's nice to see that was put out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we go ahead.
I'm trying to think of the actor who was on Star Trek who played Japanese American actor.
Oh,
I'm not a Trekkie. My wife would know this all the time.
Talking about the original Trek or the modern?
The original from the 60s. Yeah.
Oh.
I can't. I can't think of the actor's name.
It slipped my mind. I could have told you any other day, but you put me on the spot.
He was interned in Arkansas in the camp. Yeah. So I think he was born in 38 or 39. So as a very young child.
George Takei.
George Takei. Thank you. Yeah, Arkansas. So they had those camps as far east as Arkansas.
Before we move on real quick, before we wrap up the show, we always usually end with what you read. But I want to remind everybody, because it's been a while since we've really hit it, we want to hear from you. Please send us an email to mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. We want to hear what's going on in your lives, any suggestions, comments, questions, anything you have for the show. And as we did tonight, if you haven't done so, please go over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. Click on that Patreon link. Sign up and subscribe. It'll cost you $1 a month. It goes a long way to support the show. But, or you can support the show by simply going to YouTube. Go to YouTube, like, subscribe, watch some of our videos. You can participate and ask questions during the live stream like Anthony did from WLVN 1940s Radio tonight. There's, I didn't see it at the beginning, but when we first started the show, fan Gabe Riviera came on and said he's currently stationed North Island of Coronado, California. And so you guys can participate in the conversation that way. And so real quick, I'm on the same book, so I'm not going to get into it. But Jeff, what you reading?
Well, I talked a little bit about it last week, and I finished it since then, and it is an absolute must-read. I've read a lot of books about the Second World War from all perspectives. I've read very little about strictly from the Navy perspective. I'm just not a Navy guy, and I just had a hankering to just read a book that was from that perspective, right? Navy runs very deep with my great-grandfather and my maternal grandfather, and I found I just never really read a book just strictly from the naval perspective. This is the book, The Heart of Hell by Mitch Weiss. This is the book we have referenced many times on the podcast, and I hope my clock isn't too much of a distraction back there. I know it's gone. But we've referenced it many times with Dennis on the show. That it's Dennis's research, it's his hard work, and it's his passion, and it's his family that made that book possible, even though it was written by Pulitzer Prize winning author Mitch Weiss. But guys, I was telling Don this a little bit before the show, and he said, "Man, wait till we go live." But there's a reason I don't read about today's war, right? I don't want to read about it. It's not that I don't care. I don't want to. I had never thought so much about my time in Baghdad as I did reading The Heart of Hell. I didn't think that a gunner on a Humvee would have so much in common with a sailor on an LCI gunboat in the shadow of Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima. And I'm not saying that comparing services in any way or comparing tour of duty in any way, but the things that I was subjected to and that my battle buddies were subjected to was so much in common with what these guys had to do. And when you man, it's an emotional book. Read it. It's a must read. If you're not a Navy fan, even, you're going to get so much out of it, because this was such a pivotal part of the Battle of Iwo Jima, and it happened 2 days before the Marines ever hit the beach. And it's sickening that it's so overlooked at what those gunboats did, the sacrifices that were made, the importance of the frogmen and the UDT teams that went in on those lanes prior to. But this is the most human story that you're going to find in a book about the Second World War. You are going to see relationships born through letters. You're going to see love born through letters. You're going to read excerpts from these letters. You're going to see families completely pulled apart. You're going to see young lives completely snuffed out. And you fall in love with these men for the first 300 pages of this book. You can hear them laugh. You know what songs they like. You know what their girlfriends' names are. You know what their daughter's name is. You know the girl that they say that they're going to marry when they get home. And these guys don't get home. So many of them do not get home. Read The Heart of Hell, the untold story of courage and sacrifice in the shadow of Iwo Jima, that would not be possible but without our friend Dennis Blocker and his grandfather's unbelievable sacrifice, being one of the few that actually walked away from that without any physical scars. Nobody walked away from LCI 449 without lasting scars, without emotional scars. And it's a service that we need to always have in our hearts and in our minds as moving forward, of just what 71 men did on a small boat off the coast of Iwo Jima so long ago.
Wow.
Hey, Robert.
Yes.
What you reading?
I'm still reading here, let me grab it. The author's name here. Let's see. My wife moved it. Book by a guy named Gallagher, who wrote it back in 83 or 84. He's a polio victim, and he's a historian, and it's a book I referenced a little while ago. It's called FDR's Splendid Deception, about how he hid the extent of his polio. And it just gives you an incredible insight into somebody. I mean, we go through, all of us go through certain, physical ailments. I'm almost 70 now, so, but to lose to use the use of your legs, and bear in mind when FDR lost his use of his legs in 1921, the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, was 70 years away.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so nothing was going to be easy for him. Plus the fact he wanted to disguise as to how bad. So this is a man who's very, very courageous. He's just going to meet it head on, and he comes up to it, and just the generosity of him, in the sense that after 5 years of dealing with polio and coming to grips with it, he comes across this broken down sanitarium in western Georgia called Warm Springs, and FDR is worth about $60 million. So he spends about $1 million, and with some friends, and they actually buy this place and they rehabilitate it, and they open it up free of charge to people who've had polio or spinal injuries. And they hire doctors. They start working on new therapies. There's what they call the Warm Springs crutch, which is still being used, which was developed by that hospital. And then as they realized that they just, over several years, they created this foundation, but it's not doing enough. They need to raise more money, particularly to find a cure for polio. He creates the March of Dimes, and he puts his name on the line. He says, I want people to send their dimes to me in the White House. And it's a private foundation. There's no government money involved. And he's just inundated by people. The first year they raise over $2.6 million. Now, this is 1938. That's like $60 million nowadays. And it's just a lot of children sending money into it. And it takes 17 years, and he doesn't live to see it, but eventually a vaccine, 2 different vaccines are developed to eradicate polio completely. And he did this just because it was the right thing to do. He's a very decent person. It's the right thing to do. He'd been a victim, and he didn't want other people to go through that. So it's one of those little sort of measures of people's, I mean, it's something that he didn't have to do, but he did. He wanted to help others. So a certain generosity of spirit type of thing. And it's just remarkable leadership too. I mean, here's a man who, he's fought the Great Depression. He's commander-in-chief during the Second World War. I mean, that's not enough. He's got to do something else. So, I mean, you can't fault those Roosevelts on lack of energy. They're just constantly going at it. So, yeah, I'm still reading that. It's just, but he talks about the day-to-day preparations. I mean, not to be gross, but think about it. You get dressed, you've got this steel cage underneath your clothes, and you've got to go to the bathroom all of a sudden, just like that. What do you do? I mean, it's like, those are the day-to-day things you need to worry about. Just to give you an example, not to gross you guys out, I had bowel surgery a few months ago, and I've had to wear a temporary ostomy bag, which I'm doing, I'd say, 8 months now. Believe me, the novelty is beginning to wear off. It comes off in about 3 weeks, so they hook me back up.
Sure.
But, just having to wear this thing for the last 8 months, and, I was at, and it protrudes. So I had to have my uniform recut by my tailor last week to hide the bulge in the front, So we had, and this guy's really creative. So, I mean, and that's just a minor thing. It's temporary. I get it, another 3 weeks, they hook me back up. This goes away. But it's been an inconvenience, but it's a minor. I mean, imagine not having use of your legs for the rest of your life. But the thing about Roosevelt was that he was convinced, and he was in denial. I mean, he really thought that if he lived long enough, they would find a cure for polio, and that he could be cured. Of course, you can't cure polio once you get it. You can vaccinate for it, you can prevent it, but you can't cure it.
Well, even if they found a quote-unquote cure, you can't reverse the lack of years of using your leg muscles.
No, the nerves that have died because of that type of thing. But just that ability to to push on and continue and to try to help others. And it's just my your respect for somebody. It's just very, very moving that. And of course, like a lot of people, he had his faults, he had flaws. I mean, my goodness. But it's just he was very, very human that way. But what a really decent person and what a courageous person, I think is my kind of takeaway on that.
They often say
we don't appreciate. This is a book I've known about for 35 years. I just got around to reading it last couple of weeks.
Well, I'm going to wrap up the show with this quote, and that is, "We never appreciate our health until we're sick."
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so, for myself, Jeff Copsetta, and Mr. Robert Tidwell, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight, sir.
Jeff's been trying to get me on for a year now, and we just haven't been able to. I was doing Harvey to play Harvey a year ago, and I said I just can't make that one, and then things got sidetracked. But thank you. I'm really delighted and very, very honored to be on your program. I've heard very nice things about it. So,
well, I appreciate your time, and for everybody here, we will talk to everyone next week.
Yeah, Jeff, it's good to see you again, and I'm one of your biggest fans. I hope things are going well with you and Burnett at